Right, folks, it's almost 3 o'clock, so our schedule is going really according to plan, which is really great. We're ready now for our final speaker of the day, and this is Kevin Wilson, who's an academic liaison and collection development manager at London School of Economics Library. Kevin leads the liaison team at LSE and is keen to increase the team's impact on research and teaching taking place at LSE. He's also working to support decolonisation initiatives at LSE and beyond. He had hoped to be joined today in his presentation with his colleague Andra Fry, but unfortunately she isn't available. So I'll pass over to Kevin for the next part of the session. As I say, if you don't mind, any questions for Kevin as we go through the presentation, pop them in the chat box. Make sure your microphone is on mute. Pop your questions in the chat box and I'll pick them up from there. Once we've finished, we'll have a few closing remarks and we'll have the prize draw as well. So don't leave us when Kevin is finished. Okay, Kevin, I'll pass over to you now if you're ready.
Okay, so I think you should be able to hear me and see me now.
Yes, I can see and hear you, Kevin.
Awesome. So if I just share. So hopefully you can see my slides as well.
Yep.
Right, perfect. So yes, as Ian said, my name's Kevin Wilson. I work at the LSE. Should say immediately, I do not have a systematic review background. So if any of the questions are very technical about systematic reviews, I will be struggling. My colleague Andra, who is unavailable, unfortunately, is our systematic review librarian of sorts at LSE. So she's an academic support librarian and works with our health departments. So she does much more of the kind of working closely with researchers. I do want to give an acknowledgement to Andra's efforts here because a lot of the work that we've developed here, not just in the survey results, but the wider project to get a systematic review service off the ground is very much her work. So I would like that publicly acknowledged. So in terms of where we are, so what I'll be presenting today is just the results of a survey. It's a survey that some of you may remember. Last summer, we ran a survey and put it through a number of GISMail lists and similar lists to ask people about their experiences of supporting systematic reviews, the pros and cons. I know we've kept you waiting for about 8 months for those results, and we're sorry for that. But as soon as we saw the UHMLG meeting conference come up, we thought that was a perfect time to kind of show you the results of that survey. Putting it in some kind of context, the survey was just one part of a wider piece of work where we asked our library leadership team if we could scope out the viability of developing a systematic review service. The rationale for it really was that we did a lot of looking at how much systematic reviews are conducted at LSE. A lot of you might be thinking, LSE is a social sciences institution, it doesn't teach health or medicine, why is it doing systematic reviews? But we actually have health departments who kind of work in the intersection of health and public policy. So it's certainly coming from a political angle and intervention angle. And we found that 175 systematic reviews have been done since 2000, but actually 149 of those have been in the last 8 years. So we're looking at about 19 a year. We've had an increase in demand for support by health researchers. I'll mention something in a minute about what we found out about the skills of researchers, but it very much echoes what James was saying earlier about not as high as we'd hope. So we have that increased demand for support. We've been providing ad hoc support for a number of years, but we've had to decline probably as many requests as we've helped out on, just due to capacity within the team. The other thing recently is that we had a formal meeting with the head of a research centre where we talked about how we might be able to support them earlier going forward. We wanted to keep that relationship going, and he very much said that he would lobby the school for extra resources. So that will come out in some of the consequences that I talk about in the recommendations. We also did a literature review where we looked at a number of areas to do with systematic review, such as areas of concern about how they're conducted. So again, following on from what Jane was saying. Bits about funder requirements. So funders are surprisingly not as strict on how systematic reviews are conducted as you would think. Again, more about researcher skills and also more about what the role of librarians are. So how librarians have developed skills to support researchers and how libraries have developed systematic review services, because there's obviously no one size fits all method, as we will find out in a second. And that the way that libraries have gone about it will vary very much from institution to institution. We did a review of skills within the team. So most of us have attended some form of training, whether that's at York, Leeds or Exeter. But one thing we did do was an internal review of the skills that we have within the team. We used, I'll tweet the article later, or if somebody finds it, please pop it in the chat. There's an article by Townsend in 2017 in the JMLA, which developed a competency framework for systematic review librarians. So it involved looking at about 26 competencies on a traffic light system, high, medium, and low, so we could map out where we thought the skills were within our team. And then we looked at the current support for how we're providing systematic review support at LSE. So we've worked on 11 projects over 3 years at various levels of involvement. Some at co-authorship, probably about 3 or 4 of those, a lot just providing ad hoc support here and there. And then we met with researchers in our main health-related research centre in August last year, and just identifying what the future projects that they've got on the coming up are, and also how we could support them earlier. I won't have the results of this other survey we did today, but we did survey around 50 staff and researchers in different departments and centres at LSE to find out would they actually use the service if we developed one. In terms of looking at different systematic review models, we looked at around 10 systematic review service models in the US, and largely looked at, well, what could we steal? We tried to look at which services might be more comparative to what we might be able to offer. So some were doing, going the whole hog, doing everything very much hands-on. Some were very much more, ad hoc advice and feedback rather than more hands-on work. So we pulled all this together into a series of recommendations for our library leadership team. It was ambitious. It could be scaled up or down depending on which resources we're likely to be given. At the very end, I will tell you the outcome of that, but I won't hold you in suspense anymore, and I'll talk much more about the survey. So it's largely allowing institutions to discuss their experiences of supporting systematic reviews, the pros and cons, basically how they actually kind of went about doing it. So in terms of results, so the way we delivered this, we used Qualtrics to do a mixed method survey. And when I say mixed methods, basically all the questions were quantitative apart from the last 2, which were qualitative. But in many ways, they were the hardest ones to actually decipher because we were trying to interpret people's free text comments. So we distributed it to a number of mailing lists, just mail lists and others, for a 3-week period. And we grouped our questions into 5 particular groups. So the first was on basically the basics of systematic review support that librarians and information specialists offer. Then a bit more about the extent of the systematic review support they offered, so just drilling into a bit more detail. Then a section much more about staffing, so which staffing resources do you have, how much time did they spend on systematic reviews. Volume, which is much more about the quantity of systematic reviews and how long they might take. The last section was the other aspects was largely around the pros and cons, which are very much the qualitative questions, and any final comments that people wanted to give us. So in terms of taking the first section, which is just the basics of systematic review support that librarians and information specialists offer. So we had a few questions here. The consent agreement, I won't need to give you the results because everyone consented, or if they didn't consent, they just didn't complete the rest of the survey. There were 2 sections about really which institution are you from. We were asking geographically, where are you from, but also what kind of institution were you? Then we asked people's job titles. We wanted to know if people were employed as information specialists, where they were doing the bulk of their work on supporting systematic reviews, or were they trying to juggle this alongside other responsibilities? And then question 4 was asking, are you actually providing support for systematic reviews? We wanted to keep that question in there because we wanted libraries who aren't doing this but who want to be able to contribute as well, so we can pick up where the support is being missed in certain institutions. So in terms of question 2, I should say if you don't like graphs, you're you're going to have an awkward next half an hour, maybe. There's a lot of bar charts coming. So in terms of question 2, what institution are you from? As you'll see, we had a really rich geographical spread, much bigger than we were expecting. We had replies from 20 countries, and as you'll see, they're spread all over the world. So 78 libraries responded to this question. I should say every question doesn't have the same number of responses. Basically, people weren't compelled to answer questions. They could skip questions if they wanted to. So 78 will not be the number of standard answers per question. It may go up and down. But 78 said where they were from, and about 2/3 of those were UK-based. To be honest, we were probably expecting all of them to be UK-based. But a sizable third were spread across the world. And if you see some of the countries below, you'll see that we're looking at North America, Australia, Europe, Africa. So what it shows is that concerns about systematic review support cross countries and continents. It's not very much a UK HE issue. It's an issue that anyone supporting systematic review can kind of empathise with. So we asked where they were from. Now we asked what kind of institution did you work in? So most people answered that they were working at a university. Some, because of the list that we sent the survey out on, some worked in hospitals or independent medical colleges or research centres. To some extent, some of those will be affiliated with the universities anyway. But most respondents were working in a university setting. So in question 3, we asked people's job titles. We left this as a free question. So largely we've interpreted people's responses and we grouped them into these sections. So if you look second along, you'll see that information specialist is only 17 out of around 77 responses. So a small number of people supporting systematic reviews who answered are currently doing this as their main job. As you'll see on the other end of the spectrum, subject librarians are 23, so that's the biggest number. Subject librarians may be spending, depending on which departments they work with, may spend a lot of time on systematic reviews, but the chances are that subject librarians and anyone in any of these other roles are likely to be juggling other responsibilities. We do dig a bit further into this a bit later, but I think what it shows us is that most people who are working on systematic reviews are doing this on top of another job. And therefore balancing those competing workloads and competing priorities is likely to be pretty difficult for them. To be honest, that's the experience we were having as well. So that's why it's good that we can see that actually that's a common problem. So in terms of question 4, I don't know what the people who said no would find out of the rest of the survey necessarily, but we did want to make sure that we did ask this question. So obviously the vast majority of libraries were supporting systematic reviews. Now that could be to any extent. Obviously those who said no could continue with the rest of the survey, but in many instances they may not have answered some of the subsequent questions. So if there's a drop off in answer rates for subsequent questions, the libraries who've said no here just may not be able to contribute. But I think they would want to pick up what kind of discussions people are having about systematic reviews, and it might inspire them to think about how they develop their own services afterwards. So in terms of looking at the extent of systematic review support provided, again, we had a series of questions here as well. So we asked which aspects of the systematic review process does the team provide support for and to what extent. Question 6 asks, how does your team support these stages? And question 7 asks, does your team provide any online resources to support systematic reviews? So this is probably the most dizzying graph you're going to see. So again, we took those systematic review competencies from the Townsend 2017 article, and we came up with 26 options for how a librarian or an information specialist might be able to support systematic reviews. And then what we asked is, do you advise on those? Do you collaborate on those? Do you perform those tasks? Or are you not involved at any stage? Obviously, if you're advising or collaborating, you're much more hands-off than if you're performing the tasks where you're much more hands-on. If your eyes kind of go to where the larger blue sections are, you'll probably see that the greatest hands-on support, where people are either performing tasks or to some extent collaborating, tend to be very much in the searching-based results, in the middle, if you can see where my cursor's going. So largely they're around developing search strategies, translating strategies through other databases, conducting searches on databases, and deduplicating results. Librarians tend to be much more advisory kind of at these starting points here. So that will include selecting review types, formulating research questions, and developing inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then the areas in yellow, which you'll see here, where librarians basically are not involved at any point, are things like funding applications, data extraction, protocol development. These may be areas where librarians feel that that's the responsibility of the review team to focus on those. So I think what we see from this graph is that it's a very complex picture of support, and there's absolutely no consensus. If we were asked by our leadership, say, okay, what's the picture of other libraries in terms of systematic review support? All we could say is it's complicated. So depending on what type of university you are or what type of institution you are, you may do some things that other libraries aren't doing at the moment. But generally, the much more hands-on side of things is on the searching, and everything else tends to be a bit more advisory, collaborative, or just things that aren't covered. So we asked people, how does your team support these stages? And this was a multiple choice question. So you might think that the numbers here add up to a lot more than the respondents that we had. So in terms of training does tend to be a popular option, but as you can see, one-to-one training is much more likely than group training. Part of the reason for that is that research teams might be fairly disparate. They might be spread across different institutions. It might all be difficult to get them all in the same room. Some people on the research team may have different responsibilities, or different tasks are under their ownership. So it's probably much more likely in that sense that an information specialist or librarian who's doing training would be doing training with one person. Obviously, there are options now that training can be done by webinars, and certainly Andrea has done webinars for research teams who work across institutions. But in terms of the training, it's much, much more likely that people are going to deliver one-to-one training than group training. Feedback and advice, as we saw on the previous slide, that tends to be a common area rather than hands-on support. And as you'll see, that feedback is often given on things like search strategies. So, you might do some training with a researcher. You might say, okay, can you go ahead and do a search strategy and I'll give you feedback on it later. That tends to be a common option. And the advice that we'll give might be, well, okay, this is how you should develop a search strategy, and then you take it from there. You'll see that actually working as part of a review team, where you're doing much more hands-on work, creating and running searches, and doing a lot of the reference management work, tends to be the least chosen option. Should say the 9 others there were largely people saying in qualitative comments, we do all of this, or we do variations on this. On average, libraries were doing, in terms of number of respondents we had to this question, on average, people were doing about 3 of these. So they could be doing one-to-one training, feedback, advice, one-to-one training, advice, working as part of a team. So most libraries probably won't do one of these. They'll probably do a range of all of them. So then we asked, does your team provide any online resources? So in terms of how do you educate users, do you give them resources that allows them to refer to them rather than needing necessarily to refer to you? Can you provide them resources that would give them ongoing support? Obviously, the most inevitably chosen choice here is subject guides, because if there's one thing librarians like, it's doing subject guides or libguides. So that tended to be the most common option, is that all the information that a researcher might need to know about doing a systematic review could all be put in one place. Other options that were chosen were videos. Videos will be quite labor intensive and time consuming. But if you do short videos, they may not need that much maintenance necessarily. A much lesser chosen option was doing a VLE course. So basically creating a systematic review course, like a pathway that people can go through. That, I imagine, was chosen much less because it really would be very labor intensive, time consuming. And if one aspect of it goes out of date or something changes, there may be a lot of work to kind of unpick that and restart it. The 23 others were largely saying we do a combination of some of these, but obviously there's still a sizable minority of libraries who basically aren't offering anything. So it's interesting that some libraries, if they're not providing much of a service or not promoting much of a service, they may not have any kind of web presence or resources at all, just in case that kind of draws attention to a service that they're not able to deliver at the moment. So this section, the next section, was very much asking about staffing and staff capacity and how staff build up the skills to support systematic reviews. So we've asked, how have team members been trained? And I think a lot of these findings will be very familiar to your own experiences. We asked a question about how many research staff there are in your institution, how many staff there is in your team to support systematic reviews. Is their role solely supporting systematic review? So again, going back to what their job title is, we obviously realise that a minority of people working on these roles as information specialists. And we also wanted to unpick that more by finding out what percentage of their role, often people are guesstimating, is spent supporting systematic reviews, just so we could see how much of a challenge it is for libraries to support this if it's not their day job, in effect. So we gave people options for self-taught training, i.e. they would learn how to do it themselves, in-house training, so that might be some form of peer training with a colleague who has a lot more expertise than them, or external training. The external training is very popular. I'm sure most people listening, particularly in the UK, have been to some of the trainings such as CRD, YHEC, SURE, etc. I think we're all very appreciative when these courses run, and we certainly try to make sure at LSC that our two main systematic review librarians have been on most of those courses, but we certainly see the benefits of those. In some cases, a library may send somebody to one of those training and then cascade it down to colleagues. So that in-house training may pick up people who've been to external training. In terms of the other number is quite high because most people said we've done one or two or three of those options. So generally people are being well trained, and obviously a lot of training still requires that hands-on experience and the practice that people get working on reviews. But generally people are putting a lot of emphasis on developing the skills, attending training, and building that expertise. So actually these are quite reassuring results, I think, that people are, one, learning from experts from across the UK, but also that they're cascading training within their own institutions, or people are self-motivated enough to learn things for themselves. Then we asked a question about how many research staff there were in your institution, and this would obviously be a bit of a guess. But obviously, as you can see, the two most popular options are at either ends of the extreme. So if you're working at an institution that has, say, a small health department, the way that LSE does, we would probably be in that first bracket. We would have a small number of researchers that we're aware of. And likewise, if you work at a medical research centre where basically the whole research staff are working in one large area of health, you'd be on the other end of that spectrum. And obviously there are smaller numbers in between. We appreciate that a lot of people would be guessing these to some extent, that you wouldn't necessarily know accurate numbers. But I think what we can pick up here is that, one, there's no consensus, and two, often it's at the extremes. So in a lot of cases, institutions are supporting a small number of health researchers, but likewise, as we'll see in a minute, they have a small number of staff able to provide that support as well. So we asked basically how many staff do you have who are able to support systematic reviews. We didn't necessarily ask to what extent, so whether they're, they have, a decade of experience, or they're just, quite new to it. But again, most of the chosen options were very much in the lower end. So actually the vast majority, or 2/3 of the responses, were basically between 1 and 3. But even then, 4 and 5 were the next chosen options. And again, probably only a handful of institutions would have a large team. Obviously Cardiff, as we learned this morning, do have a large number of subject librarians who could work on systematic reviews, but obviously possibly to different extents. But what we find here is that most libraries do not have a large pool of people that they can draw on. And again, if they're quite time poor because they have other responsibilities in their role, they may not be able to devote as much time to supporting systematic reviews as they would like. And then we asked, are people's roles just supporting systematic reviews? And there will be a bit of a difference between this question and the question where we asked job titles, because I think some of the people who answered information specialists before may not have answered this question. But obviously it's a very, very low number of people who are supporting systematic reviews day in, day out as the bulk of their job. Most people are doing this on top of other responsibilities. And therefore, again, balancing those workloads will be very, very difficult. And if we want to do justice by our researchers and help them as much as possible, like we're having at LSE, there may be discussions that need to be had across libraries and across universities, because it takes a lot of time to support systematic reviews, a lot of resources, and it's very hard to just say, okay, well, we'll add that on somebody's job, because it very quickly becomes much, much bigger than you anticipate. So in question 12, we asked what percentage of their role roughly was spent supporting systematic reviews. And again, there'll be a bit of I think, a drop-off in terms of people who said this was their full-time job, because obviously nobody has said between 80 and 100% here, unless, I suppose, if they thought it was 100, they may have not answered. But most people who are, say, subject librarians for health and doing this on top of their normal work, that's the vast majority. So most of them are spending probably the equivalent of a day a week, or in another scenario, up to 2 days a week. We talk in the challenges about things like workload creep. So when people are employed as subject librarians, even in health, and they would have had a job description that possibly didn't talk about systematic reviews, but that's gradually, as researcher interests have changed, that's gradually added on top of their job. So I think what we found out in these questions largely is that people who are supporting systematic reviews are doing so very much without other aspects of their job being taken into consideration. And certainly there was one of the talks earlier talked about task shifting, and basically how you can alleviate people's workloads, take things from them that allows them to build the time up. And certainly that's the thing that we're thinking about at LSE with Andrea and her other colleague who work on systematic reviews. How can we find ways to remove tasks from them in order to give them more time and build more time into their workload to support systematic reviews? And it is a challenge. We are hopefully making some movement there, as I'll talk about at the end, but I get the feeling from these results that across institutions, balancing those workloads is very, very difficult. So the next section was looking at basically the volume of systematic review supported, so looking at more kind of numerically how much work does it involve. We asked basically how many systematic reviews has the team supported in the last year, for how many reviews have they been part of the review team, for how many reviews have they been co-authors, and what is the average number of hours spent per review. Certainly this morning there was obviously a lot of discussion about how to charge systematic reviews, and we do ask that a bit later. But obviously knowing how long an average systematic review takes would certainly help in terms of charging if you were trying to basically recover the cost of that member of staff. It sounds like some people just kind of guess a rough time, but if you want a number to work with when we get to question 16, you can take that as your new number. The question 13 was asking basically how many systematic reviews have you supported in the last year? Don't be too alarmed by the 3 lines. Hopefully you'll see what they mean, but I'll interpret them in a minute. So what we have is largely a lot of libraries supporting a small number of reviews. That's again largely because they have a small number of researchers and they have a small number of library staff. So it's possible that libraries would want to support more reviews, but just in terms of workload, they just can't. And obviously these numbers here, there are a few libraries, again, these could be these medical research centres where they're supporting, somebody supporting 250 a year. I hope that was a rough guess and not an exact amount, but certainly that skews the results. So that's why I've included the mean average here of around 30, and also a high level of standard deviation. So basically between these different libraries, there are huge variations in the results. So that mean average of 31 is very much distorted by the higher end libraries that have 100 or more. So the majority of libraries here are probably supporting between 0 and 20, but very much more in single figures, I would say, in most cases. Then asking about for how many have they been part of the review team. You'll see respondent 11 is part of the review team for more than 100. I'm guessing that's the 250 library from the previous slide. But again, being part of the review team doesn't seem to be very common. Again, that probably depends on what form of help you're providing. So if you're very much doing advisory, feedback work, or training, there may not be an expectation that you're part of a review team. So again, yeah, depends on the levels of support that you're providing. But a lot of libraries here you'll see are not part of any review teams at any point. Probably a decent number, probably about a third of the libraries here are never part of a review team. Again, it's just a small number of libraries that are, possibly because of the institutions they work in, possibly because of the kind of research culture that's built up. But by and large, libraries are not formally part of a review team. A lot of it is probably done on a very ad hoc basis, or the relationship is deliberately kept quite loose. In terms of co-authorship, a lot of libraries are successful in becoming co-authors. I mean, obviously there's a debate to be had about what constitutes co-authorship, but certainly where people are doing much more hands-on work, I think it's only fair that they're acknowledged for the work they do. In terms of most libraries who are providing that more ad hoc support, in terms of training researchers, advising them, giving feedback, that may not necessarily qualify for co-authorship. So that may be why the mean average number of reviews that libraries are co-authors on is quite low. But again, it's very much skewed by a large number of libraries where I think that's built into their culture. But again, there's a large number of libraries here, similar to the last question, who are not part of research teams, so they're not co-authors. But again, that's just the level of support that they're providing at the moment. Then asking about number of hours that libraries spend. And obviously this is going to change, be very different according to institution and also depending on the level of support that you're providing. Again, as you'll see, there's big variations between libraries. Some libraries will spend more than about 150 hours per review. That seems a lot, but it probably depends the extent to which you're involved. The mean average here is around 34. So I'm guessing if you could use that as a number for charging. I'm sure we spoke to a library before who said they charged at 35 hours. So actually that probably is right on the money, really. But a lot of libraries, again, you'll see very, very kind of small skyscrapers here, where they're spending 20 hours or fewer per review. Because again, it could just be advice, feedback, training here and there, things that probably take fewer than 10 hours. So in terms of other aspects of systematic review support, what we asked in this section was, do you provide a formalized systematic review service? i.e., is it something that you're actively promoting? Deleth this morning said about Cardiff that they basically didn't need to promote themselves. People found out about it through word of mouth. And, you know, when you do good work, people hear about it and people want more of it. Do you provide guidelines? Do you provide terms and conditions? So things like memorandums of understanding. Do you have an established relationship that the review team ought to abide by as well? Question 18, we did talk about cost recovery basis because we know that some libraries will charge, and in many ways charging is the way to keep the service basically, you know, financially viable. And then questions 19 and 20 were very much qualitative questions, and when I show you the results, we've tried to do that diagrammatically. So we've asked basically people what are the positives of supporting systematic reviews and what are the challenges, and there's a number in both. So in terms of formalized systematic review services, it's a fairly mixed split here. A lot of libraries say no, possibly for the reasons that Deleth and maybe others have talked about, where if you actively promote a service, particularly if it's largely an ad hoc service, advisory, feedback driven, you may suddenly create much more demand than you have capacity to deliver. So for a lot of libraries, they may avoid formalizing a service and promoting a service because they need to manage researcher expectations, and you know, you can't promise something that you ultimately can't deliver on. But actually a reassuring number of libraries actually do say that they do provide a formalized service. Now again, they may specify in those services what they will support. So they may again say it's advisory only, we will do this, but also specify what they won't do. And I think whatever service you develop, whether it's a fairly, you know, low-key, low-scale service or basically probably where you'll do much more hands-on work. I think setting out those service guidelines and managing people's expectations is the important thing. I don't think people will mind if you say we can't do X, Y, and Z, as long as you're honest and upfront about it. And then we asked about cost recovery basis. Again, following on from the average number of reviews that you have, you might want to put a cost on basically the work, trying to recover the staff salary effectively, and you might put that money to providing extra staffing or other areas of library work that need investment. It's a bit of a poison chalice, really charging. There will obviously be administrative headaches. You might think about some researchers are better funded than others, in which case you worry, do you create a two-tier service? Do you prioritize those who can pay over those who can't? Most libraries have said we just don't charge. Basically, we see that as a vital part of library research support work, and it's something that maybe researchers expect. So only a few libraries charge at any point, basically. Some libraries will say we charge every time. Again, that may be a long-standing arrangement that's been built in. Some will say we're charging when part of the team because their role is much more hands-on, it's much more time-consuming. There's probably much more of a need to recover that time back. But if most people are providing advisory support that's less than 10 hours, you might think it's probably just not worth trying to recover the money back there. Should say most of the people who said other basically said variations on, we might charge if we spend more than X number of hours on this. So reassuringly, it doesn't look like trying to recover the costs of supporting systematic reviews is popular. And certainly when we're upscaling the service we provide at LSE, it's not likely to be popular amongst our director there either, let alone researchers. So we asked people a question for what the positives of supporting systematic reviews were. And again, these were qualitative comments. So if you imagine 100 libraries responded and gave lots of free text comments, we spent basically as much time analysing the previous 18 questions, analysing the next 2 actually. So I'll show you the final diagram at the end, which was basically a sorting of all the answers. But what we did here is we used kind of inductive coding, and we used coding hierarchies of parent, child, and sibling to basically unpick what we thought people were saying here. So we kind of grouped the positives into 4 main areas. 4 main areas that we thought would be effectively the beneficiaries of providing a systematic review service and supporting systematic review service. So number 1 was for the library and the team providing the support, and I'll unpick those into slightly kind of more nuanced areas in a sec. For the librarians or staff providing the support, so the impact it has on individuals, the impact it has on researchers, and also the impact on the institution and the wider world. So what we've got here is just looking at the impact and the benefits for the library and the team providing the support. So basically 52 responses were received that we basically attributed to that area. And then you'll see the breakdown of comments here. So taking the benefits of the library team as the parent. In terms of the child, we've got library's profile, engagement with departments, knowledge and understanding, and additional income. So these were the main kind of headings of benefits for the library and team. And then kind of each sub-benefit was for the library's profile, it raises its profile across the institution, but also allows us to increase and demonstrate our impact. So we can show that the library has a positive impact on knowledge production and research. In terms of engagement and with departments, basically we're seen as more trusted partners, we're seen as people who can help researchers deliver. So that increases our engagement and maybe allows us to identify other engagement opportunities. Obviously, most people supporting systematic reviews are probably doing a liaison role to some extent already. So in many ways, it may just be an extension of what they're doing. But the other things that librarians are seen as peers. So sometimes, librarians may think that they're under-regarded in an institution, or that departments don't see them as equal partners. But actually, I think opportunities supporting systematic reviews very much adjusts that relationship and changes how departments perceive us. In terms of knowledge and understanding, basically for us, it has benefits in terms of that hands-on practice that we're doing with systematic reviews to back up what we've learned through training. It improves our subject knowledge, it increases our understanding of what researchers need, and it improves our teaching. Again, as we've seen, cost recovery isn't popular, so the whole thing about additional income only had a couple of responses, but that's another potential benefit for the library. In terms of benefits for librarians or staff individually, job satisfaction was a really big aspect here. So 15 responses were for job satisfaction, expertise got 30 responses, and recognition 15. So again, it kind of builds on what we saw on the previous slide. So in terms of job satisfaction, people feel happy with their work. They feel the work is meaningful and making a difference, and that the work they're doing is interesting and challenging. So actually, in many ways, what it allows librarians to do is to do something a bit different to what researchers as peers. It allows them to identify new opportunities at work. In terms of expertise, again, it's just developing the skills and expertise that they've learned on their training, putting that very much into practice. In terms of recognition, co-authorship is a big deal, and certainly Andrea has co-authored a couple of systematic reviews, and certainly she's found that kind of recognition she gets in departments now is really beneficial. And in many ways, it's just nice to be rewarded for working and for contributing to research, because the role of an information specialist or a librarian in this work is not insignificant. I mean, it would all fall apart without it. And as we've seen from Jane's talk earlier, we know that search strategies are more transparent, robust, and reproducible when a librarian is involved. In terms of benefits for researchers, so they feel better supported by the library with their research, and it also improves their knowledge and skills. So if we're looking at doing training with researchers, hopefully they come out of that thinking, okay, I know what to do in this instance now. And in terms of benefits for the institution, there are a lot of responses, there are actually 33, so that people saw how this role and how this work that they were doing contributes to the bigger picture. So what it does, it allows us to build links and collaborations across the institution, so largely with departments, but maybe with research offices and so on. Basically, I think we see that the work that we're doing improves the quality of research and research outputs at the institution. We see how it contributes to the institutional strategy. That wasn't really chosen that much. But alongside the improving the quality of research was that we're contributing to evidence-based research. So we see that it's research that's making a sizable difference. So in the case of LSE, because our health is very much the intersection of health and public policy, a lot of what we do tends to be systematic reviews on like mental health interventions. So certainly someone like Andrew would see that as very meaningful work, and you see the difference that work makes. So just to kind of summarize this section a bit, really, the most frequently mentioned positives, regardless of kind of where they sit in the structure necessarily, was that staff develop skills and expertise. They improve the quality of research and publications at the institution, that researchers feel better supported, that librarians now collaborate as peers and maybe get the recognition of doing that. And that recognition also stems into co-authorship where it's available. And that it raises the library's profile, and that the library is seen as a trusted partner and a department who can improve research and get things done. You might have to squint. You'll see this more when the slides are shared, but basically this was kind of like our hierarchy that we developed of the responses. So what you'll see, you might have to tilt it around, but you'll see the top level benefits here. And then when we use that kind of inductive coding to create a hierarchy of parent, child, and sibling, you'll see these here and the responses that people gave. As you can imagine, we did exactly the same for the challenges. So again, when people describe what the challenges of supporting systematic reviews were, we grouped them into these 5 areas. So 1 is very much about the systematic review service in itself and how that operates. 2 is very much around resources and capacity. So how can we have the resources in place to supporting systematic reviews? The impact on the review team. So that's the researchers outside the library, obviously. How we manage expectations so we don't kind of set ourselves up for a fall by over-promising too much. And keeping up to date, whether that's methods, search interfaces, technology, very much kind of follows on from Julie's presentation just before, that keeping up to date is really important as things change. So the systematic review service counts, we had 32 responses there, and some of the concerns that people had is that basically demand is always likely to exceed what we can deliver. And it's very difficult to say no to people. And we've said no to researchers where we've been, in many ways, desperate to help, and we really wish we could help. But you know, if Andrew is working on a systematic review project already, again, which she's juggling her workload with, there's no way that we can work on another one. So having to say no and dealing with that demand is a really big challenge. If the library is not particularly visible in the institution, basically, I think the work that we could do just doesn't get noticed, or that people don't approach us for support. Managing the service is very much kind of more the administrative side of things. So basically, how do you manage requests coming in? If you're charging, you know, how's that work? What kind of relationships would you need to develop with finance people, for instance? So a lot of it is basically that internal administration that you need to do. And again, juggling other responsibilities. It's a perennial problem that most people are supporting systematic reviews on top of other jobs. And therefore, you know, managers need to be sympathetic, and senior managers need to be sympathetic, and need to look at ways that how can we facilitate the creation of more time in order to support systematic reviews, because the demand for this work is only going up. In terms of resources and capacity, so lack of capacity in terms of people is identified as the biggest issue here. Basically not having enough people to do the work, or not having enough expertise to do the work. Basically not having a systematic review service at all. So some libraries will provide a promoted service, some won't, but if libraries aren't offering a service, it's very unlikely that there'll be much kind of take up on it. Or actually, if you're not promoting a service, you may actually not be able to deliver anything when you're asked. Imposter syndrome, I think this was mentioned earlier, maybe in one of the comments about, again, when you're working with academics and researchers, maybe you don't feel quite at their level. You hear they're doctors and PhDs and professors. Maybe for us that we never feel we're naturally on the same footing as them. I think if we recognise what the impact of the work that we're doing is, hopefully that would dispel that. But it does seem to be an issue for a few people here. And again, lack of subject knowledge. So if you don't quite have that medical or health background that other people in the room are talking about. Also lack of access to databases and software. So again, depending on where your institution is, whether you have access to all the databases that would allow you to search, as fully as possible. So some other challenges to the review teams. This is very much kind of working with researchers, and there are obviously, as many of you know, there are challenges based. This delays in projects, so things where timelines just kind of change dramatically, and obviously you've allocated time to work on things at certain points, but then that changes rapidly. The review team, basically talking about research skills again, they have little understandings of systematic review methods. And where you're not in a position where you can do the work in a hands-on basis, you know, you're responsible for upskilling them, but to some extent it may fall on deaf ears, and we've seen that a lot of researchers do not have those skills. Lack of funding can be difficult. So again, you know, some projects will be well funded, some won't, and the ones that aren't funded, you know, do you have a two-tier system where those ones suffer? Poor collaborating relationships. I think Andrew's normally been quite okay, but I'm sure many of you have experience of working with research teams where emails or phone calls are ignored, or people just, you know, never get back to you when they say they will, or when you need things done by. And also lack of recognition. So again, you know, co-authorship can never be assumed, but if you're putting in a size of work that should require co-authorship, going to be given. Managing so again, it's much, you know, about what you can offer and what and deliver, and then what you promise people. So a lot of researchers will have unrealistic expectations. They won't know how much time goes into it. They won't know what skills are required, and they very much may kind of make demands on you that you can't fulfill. Researchers, again, this will be a common one, possibly amongst you, you know, watching, that researchers will expect you to do more than you're actually able to do. So we've had experience of this where we'll say, look, we can advise, but actually what they really want you to do is to do the work. And again, issues about saying no. Saying no is really hard, and none of us want to do it, but sometimes no is probably the best answer. No might be better than saying, well, we might be able to do it in X number of weeks, and then something comes up in X number of weeks that made it never doable anyway. Again, unsuitable search platforms, that again probably goes back to the previous slide about not having access to necessarily the databases that you need. Keeping up to date was generally kept as a small thing, and actually most people didn't raise too many issues or any kind of sub-issues related to that. So again, just in terms of what the most frequently mentioned challenges were, regardless of where they sit in the hierarchy, lack of capacity, easily the biggest. Basically, you don't have the people to do the systematic review work that is required. Again, we saw from one of the previous slides that basically most people are doing this with between 1 and 3 staff who are doing other jobs, and therefore basically committing to supporting systematic reviews becomes very difficult because you just don't know how much time you can spend on it, but largely more work is coming in than you could manage anyway. Again, dealing with demand is probably quite similar, is that basically demand exceeds what you can supply. Managing the service, again, that's more how it will be internally administered, although hopefully that probably should be overcome quite easily. Lack of systematic reviews expertise. So it could be that people haven't had the training or haven't had the hands-on experience of supporting systematic reviews. Juggling other responsibilities, again, that probably feeds into the thing about capacity, again, that people are doing systematic review work on top of their day-to-day job. And again, going back to the review team where they have little understanding of basically systematic review methods. So you're not necessarily working with peers who have a thorough understanding of how to do systematic reviews. You're largely training them whilst you're working with them. And maybe your expectations of what they know are not basically borne out in reality. So again, you might need to tilt round to have a look at this, but again, the hierarchy shows there. So you've got, these are kind of like the parent challenges again, and these are kind of like the child and sibling challenges again, with the numbers of respondents for each one. So finally, it's just really talking about where we are now, really. And luckily, we've had a couple of things change in the last week or so that at least allowed me to flesh this slide out a bit better. So, so we presented this to our library leadership team in January. They're very positive. They definitely thought it was work that we should be doing. They weren't particularly keen on us basically asking the research centres to lobby the school for more resources. Our library leadership very much thought it was something we ought to be offering internally as a service anyway. They certainly weren't keen on charging. And Andrew and I, in the report that we wrote that I talked about in the first slide, very ambitious, basically a sliding scale. And again, when you negotiate with leadership about developing a new service, you know, you tend to overpitch, and then hopefully if they meet you in the middle, you kind of get what you really wanted anyway. So we, obviously our ambitious plans were very ambitious, but the library leadership agreed to maybe start small, but then increase demand as and when we can basically, suggest and provide evidence that there is greater demand needed along the way. So at the moment, we're kind of focusing on an advisory and feedback service and training. So we'll do training, individual and group training to upskill researchers, but also we'll provide advice on developing search strategies, and we'll provide feedback on search strategies. Andrew does have a lot of experience of hands-on work, but in the short term, I think we're really going to have to manage that. And it may be something that we do for certain projects individually, but we're not going to say we're going to do it because, again, it's setting up those expectations that you can't deliver. So again, it will start fairly small, and once we can demonstrate the impact it's had, and when we can show evidence that there is growing demand, there may be resources made available to scale that up. I'll talk about how we can do that on that very last point. But in terms of extended support, different types of review, we keep talking about systematic reviews, but obviously researchers are doing different types of reviews. And the work we did with the surveyed LSE staff showed that they're doing very different types of review. So systematic reviews are just a small aspect of it. They're doing scoping reviews, rapid reviews, mapping reviews. These are all different reviews that we very quickly have to learn the differences from. I don't imagine anyone said it in the chat, and I'll put it, if somebody finds this article and puts it in the chat, great. If not, I'll tweet it. There's the article Grant and Booth, 2009, A Typology of Reviews. Read that. It breaks down about 14, I think, different types of reviews and shows you the distinctions between, you know, a scoping review, a rapid review, and a mapping review. And that's basically what we'll use as a basis to kind of build up our knowledge of what do researchers mean when they're doing different types of review, and what support would we need to provide. So that's a really good article to read to kind of unpick those different types of review. We're going to create a review protocol form. I don't think we're going to be very clever. I think we're going to steal a good example from somewhere. Basically, it'll be a form where, you know, somebody will have to say, look, this is what I'm researching, this is what I need help with, these are my timescales, etc. Rather than do it by email, where it kind of get very messy and things will get far in the wrong place. Basically, we'll have a website for systematic reviews. They create this form, we take it from there and start the conversation with them. The whole thing about how you administrate the systematic review service did come up as an issue, so we want to make this as simple as possible. And they go into our systematic review website. We do want to provide those educational resources. We'll provide links out to protocols and standards. I don't see any point in rewriting or reworking the wheel. Basically, if something exists already on the Cochrane website, you know, why are we going to rewrite it? There are videos there, link to the videos. I think ultimately what we want to do is is to create, not necessarily a VLE course, but I think we do want to create some kind of online resource that's a bit more kind of LSE specific for researchers. But again, if that involves doing things like videos or various interactive things, we'll have to think about what the workload aspect of that is. Very lastly, in terms of potential reshaping of roles, it's probably not confidential. Well, who knows? But certainly we kind of got the green light to reshape Andrea and a colleague's role to provide much more support for systematic review. So at the moment, Andrea basically is an academic support librarian. She supports systematic reviews on top of her job. What we're now looking at doing is for her and a colleague to basically really scale their role back to support systematic reviews for probably over half of their time. And then basically what we'll do is create an academic support librarian role, which is a subject librarian role, to basically pick up some of their departments. So basically at least half of Andrea and her colleagues' role will be spent on systematic reviews. And, you know, if it starts slow, they've got time to build up the website, the online resources. I think ultimately, actually, there'll be demand from the get-go. As soon as we offer this service, it will be popular. So actually, we might be thinking in a year's time, well, where do we go from here? And that actually this kind of solution we've come up with to create another subject librarian role to pick up the slack to support systematic reviews is actually just a starting point rather than an end point. So I think that's me. Do I need to stop sharing to go back to you?
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. That was really, really interesting. Some amazing information in there. It's really interesting to look at the impact of the work that's been done, what the impact that will have on LSE, and how you're sort of looking at taking it forward. There was nothing that I would identify as any particular question for you in the chat, but there was lots of discussion around about what you were talking about. Interesting things around the possibilities, I think, for shadowing opportunities, and certainly I think a lot of what you're saying chimed with a lot of people about not having enough time to devote to systematic reviews, and it was interesting, I think, just to get that validation, if you like, from that. So we really appreciate that. Isla, is there anything else you wanted to add in at this point before we move on to the excitement of the prize draw?
Are you going to be publishing your survey results in an article or something? I mean, it's great to have the preview, Kevin. I mean,
yeah. Fantastic. Yes, that was the plan. I mean, Andrew's not around at the moment, unfortunately, so we haven't had a chance to discuss that. But I think we wanted to wait for the outcome of where this work was going before we did that. But I think we would look to publish sometime this year, if assuming that all publishing models are still working remotely. But yeah, if anyone has any recommendations for where to publish, we haven't thought about it, but certainly, I mean, we knew this work was eagerly anticipated because we had emails from people who'd responded initially, I suspect, who are here today, wanting a sneak preview. But certainly, I think what it shows is that whatever experiences that we're having and whatever challenges we're having, we're not alone. That actually there's a lot of, even though there's no consensus, there kind of is a consensus that it's all very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, that's an incredibly good point to round off the day. I think we're not alone. It's all complicated, but we'll get there. With a bit of cooperation and collaborative working, and with all the good ideas that we've heard of today, we'll get there. Thank you so much, Kevin. It's brilliant.
Really
Thank you to all
that.
the speakers. It's been a great day.
Yeah.